Welcome to Blue Nile. We hope you are enjoying solving past questions with us. Let's take a look at a big question. We are going to look at a question from the December 2012 exam titled Rose Leisure. This is a 20-mark question and covers the following areas: ethics, gathering evidence, and substantive audit procedures. Please note you have 1.8 minutes for every mark in the exam, and that for a 20-mark question, no more than 36 minutes should be spent. To successfully complete this question, you will need to plan your answer, taking care with the time allocated to each part of the question. Use the scenario where needed, and have clear and efficient communication. It may be worth pausing the video at this point and printing off the exam question. That way you can follow the scenario as we talk through it. As with any question containing a scenario, it is important to plan the answer and the use of the information that has been provided. Reading the requirements before the scenario is important, so you can then identify what is needed in the scenario faster. This is crucial given the time you have in the exam. Let's now break down the requirements. Part A asks you to identify and explain each of the 5 fundamental principles contained within the ACCA's Code of Ethics and Conduct. We can see this part of the question is above the scenario, and therefore has no relation to the information below. To answer this, you must have remembered the fundamental principles in your studies and be able to explain them. Half a mark is allocated to identifying the principle. Then a further half a mark is allocated if you can explain what it means correctly. This is a 5-mark question and therefore no more than 9 minutes should be spent on this. Part B relates directly to the scenario given. It asks to describe substantive audit procedures you would perform to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence in relation to the above 3 matters. The 3 matters are referenced up in the scenario as trade payables and accruals, receivables, and reorganization. It is important to not just create general substantive audit procedures, but to use the scenario so they are relevant to the client and the situation given to you. You must also be careful with the marking allocation. Overall, Part B is 15 marks. However, Part 1 is for 6 marks and about 11 minutes should be spent. Part 2 is for 5 marks, and about 9 minutes should be spent. And finally, Part 3 is for 4 marks, and about 7 minutes should be spent. It may be a 27-minute 15-mark question in total, but treating each sub-requirement separately will ensure you do not run out of time to complete each part properly. Now, let's start structuring our answers for this question. Part A is a knowledge question asking you to identify and explain the 5 fundamental principles. These principles have been issued by the ACCA for members to apply to situations to ensure each member has good ethical behavior. In relation to audit and assurance, ethics is one of the key areas that auditors must consider when deciding whether they should accept a new client or continue to act for an existing audit client. Ethics can be defined as how to behave properly, both morally and professionally. An auditor should not act as the auditor for the client if it will affect their judgment and behavior during the assignment. As there are 5 fundamental principles, to help remember these principles, we can use the mnemonic OPIC. You need to ensure you understand the 5 principles so you can explain them in the exam. The O is for objectivity. Auditors must be objective when making decisions. This means that they must ensure they do not allow bias or other factors to influence their judgment when making decisions on the audit. If auditors remain objective during the audit, then they will be able to form an independent opinion on the financial statements. Not only will they be independent, but they will also be seen to be independent by others. The P is for professional behavior. Auditors must ensure they comply with relevant laws and regulations, and act properly to ensure that they maintain professional standards. At the end of the day, auditors are trusted to give an independent opinion, which is important to the users making decisions based on these financial statements. The other P is for professional competence and due care. Auditors need to ensure that they maintain their professional knowledge and skill needed to do their work properly. They must also follow all relevant regulations, for example, auditing standards, in order to maintain the reputation of the profession. Auditors should not take on work they are not technically competent to do. Just because you've audited one company, it does not mean you can audit all. Each industry has its own regulations and niche reporting requirements that must be understood by the auditor. The I is for integrity. Auditors should be straightforward and honest in all matters. If you use these two keywords within the sentence in your answer, you will get the marks. It's probably the easiest of the 5 to define. Finally, the C is confidentiality. For the business to trust sensitive information being handled by the auditors, they must be able to keep information confidential. No information should be passed to third parties without authority, and length should be taken to ensure information is not leaked. Therefore, no gossiping about clients. And so the 5 fundamental principles are objectivity, professional behavior, professional competence and due care, integrity, and confidentiality. 1 mark is allocated for each principle explained properly, and then move on to Part B. Part B then leans on the scenario. We had 3 matters to review for the client Rose Leisure Club. Each is referenced as a sub-requirement and has its own marking allocation. However, each of them relate to substantive audit procedures, and the requirement is to produce procedures that the auditor would carry out on these matters. Remember that a substantive audit procedure and a substantive audit test is the same thing. Don't let terminology confuse you. Remember that the aim of a substantive audit procedure is to identify if there are material misstatements contained within the financial statements. If material misstatements are identified and corrected, then the auditor is able to state the financial statements are true and fair. For every substantive audit procedure, there needs to be an objective or reason and a suitable method to obtain the evidence. The objective of a substantive test should be one of the financial statement assertions from the following: completeness, rights and obligations, allocation and valuation, existence, cutoff, occurrence, classification, and accuracy. You should mention which of these assertions has been tested in your answer. The methods the auditor uses are usually selected from the following: analytical procedures, inquiry, inspection, observation, recalculation, confirmation, and reperformance. Again, stating which method you have chosen or describing it to gather evidence is important in formulating your substantive test. A substantive test or procedure should be written ideally as a clear instruction. In practice, they would be designed at the planning stage and then carried out by an audit team when they visit the client. Therefore, you could structure your audit test as follows: state the method, describe the evidence you would collect, and then finish by explaining the objective of the test referencing the assertion. Part 1 tells us that within the trade payables balance there is a misstatement, as the purchase ledger closed 1 week earlier. This means that the trade payables balance is understated. The expectation is that they will include an adjustment to the purchase ledger or an accrual in the current year for the invoices that have been included in the following year in error. For 6 marks, we need to describe 6 substantive audit procedures that will ensure the trade payables balance and accruals are free from material misstatement. To collect evidence on this issue and the balances mentioned, we could request the list or schedule of invoices that have been posted to the following year. A procedure would be to obtain the list of invoices posted in error to the following year and inspect the purchase ledger and accruals account to identify if an adjustment has been made for the missing invoices. This will verify completeness and accuracy of the trade payables and accruals balance. Note that this is a clear instruction which describes the procedure, plus also mentions why it's being carried out. The auditor will also want to make sure that all invoices in this period have been included on that list. They can therefore look at the source documents and trace to the accounting details. For a sample of invoices dated between the 25th of October and the year end, trace to the purchase ledger and the accruals account. This will ensure invoices are recorded in the correct period and verifies completeness of payables and accruals. The auditors will also want to discuss the issue with the client management. Discuss the error with the management of Rose Leisure and identify if this is an isolated incident and what is being done to address the problem. This identifies if further errors could be within the system and verifies accuracy. The auditors could also gather some independent evidence on the balance to identify if invoices are posted correctly. For a sample of trade payable balances at the year end, send a supplier circularization letter requesting a confirmation of the year-end balance. This verifies completeness and accuracy. They could also use supplier statements as evidence to verify completeness and accuracy. And so, for a sample of supplies on the ledger with year-end balances, reconcile the ledger to the supplier statements and investigate any differences. Finally, as a sixth test, they could perform analytical procedures on the balance to identify if they look reasonable compared to the previous year. By comparing the total trade payables and accruals to the previous year, the auditor can then investigate any significant differences with the client. This would verify completeness and accuracy. They could also use ratio analysis, for example, calculating payable days ratio and comparing the previous year as another form of analytical procedure. And so, my 6 tests were based on identifying if an adjustment has been made, to review invoices in the last week to see if they were included, discuss the issue with the client, send out circularization letters to gain independent evidence, perform reconciliations on supplier statements, and perform some analytical procedures. Part B, Part 2, describes changes in the receivables balance. They now offer group memberships and have a material receivables balance for the first time. Feedback from the circularization shows some non-replies and some balances not agreeing with the customer. As this is a new process for Rose Leisure, this is a higher risk that the controls over the receivables may not be adequate. This would lead to there being a higher risk of material misstatements, and so the auditor must perform audit work to identify this. Firstly, the auditor needs to establish whether the differences are due to timing issues or errors. The circularization responses that do not agree should be reconciled to the receivables ledger to establish whether differences are due to timing or error. This verifies accuracy of the balance. If any differences relate to the timing issues, for example, cash in transit, these should be traced to the post-year-end bank statements to verify receipts occurred and the balance is accurate. If any differences from the circularization relate to errors, these should be discussed with the client for possible amendment in the ledger. This will also help verify accuracy of the receivables ledger. The remainder of the marks can relate to the non-responses. For circularization letters that have had no response, send a follow-up circularization letter. This will help verify existence of the receivable customer and balance. For any customers that have still not responded, it would be important for the auditor to perform alternative procedures to verify existence and accuracy of the balance. For example, the customers whose circularization letter has still not been received, inspect post-year-end bank statements for evidence that the customer has paid. The auditor should investigate any customers where no payments have been made for evidence they exist, and whether a bad debt provision needs to be considered. Therefore, my 5 tests on receivables were to reconcile circularization responses with differences to the receivables ledger, follow up timing differences with further evidence, discuss any errors still on the ledger with the client, resend circularization letters where there are no responses, and perform alternative procedures where responses are still not received to verify existence. Part B, Part 3, relates to the reorganization of some of the health and fitness clubs. Some are being refurbished, which will involve staff training and disposal of assets. Both of these matters will need to be reviewed to ensure they have been accounted for correctly. This part of the question relates to the accounting standard IAS 37, provisions, contingent liabilities, and assets. They want you to recognize whether the provision and any disclosures for the reorganization should be included. Remember that if the provision meets the criteria, for example, there is a present obligation, there is a probable outflow of resources, and a reliable measurement, plus the plan to reorganize is set and has been communicated, then a provision and disclosures would be allowed by the accounting standard. The auditors should therefore compare the treatment to IAS 37 to ensure it is allowed by accounting standards, verifying accuracy of the treatment. The auditors also need to ensure that the details regarding the decisions and communication are correct. If it were decided and announced before the year end, then it is further evidence that disclosures and provisions may be necessary. Inspect board minutes to identify when decisions on the reorganization were made, and whether that was prior to the year end to verify accuracy of the accounting treatment of the provision. Auditors should then also inspect the communication made to the shareholders to establish whether this was on the 29th of October. This will verify whether the decision has been communicated before the year end and has been disclosed accurately. As a fourth procedure, the auditors could also obtain the list of reorganization costs that have been included in the provision. This should be cost to ensure the total is accurate and agrees with the provision in the financial statements. Therefore, the 4 procedures I have included are: to compare the provision and disclosure to IAS 37, inspect board minutes to review the date decision made, agree the shareholders were communicated to before the year end, and obtain and cost a schedule of reorganization costs. With each of these matters in the scenario, there are many ideas that can help create audit procedures. The ACCA suggested answer has several others that can also be reviewed. The key is to ensure the procedure relates to the scenario given. If it doesn't help with the given issue, you will not get the mark. Please remember when describing substantive audit procedures, your procedures should be written as a clear instruction so the marker can see if you understand the process the auditor should perform. You should describe the method and the evidence needed to complete the test. Also, mention the objective of that test. Space out your tests so there is a gap between each one so the marker can allocate marks easily. Stick to the marking allocation and do not write lots of unnecessary procedures. Use the scenario. If you ignore it, you may well not get many marks. Finally, be careful with the timings in this question. Ensure you make notes of how long to spend on each section from Part A and Part B, so you give yourself the best chance to gain marks on each area. I hope you found this video useful. Thank you and good luck.